Where You Need to Go by D. Hill. 4 years had passed since the wreck. 4 long and terrible years of grueling physical and mental therapy. Memory lapses and nightmares that left him crying out like a scared child in the middle of the night. Though time had passed and his therapy had been declared more or less a success, the guilt he felt was as fresh as an open wound. He remembered the accident in snippets, remembered the glowing screen of his phone, the sensation of time slowing down and the cacophony of screams mixing with the sickening crunch of twisting metal. 2 months later, after he had stirred from his coma, he was informed that all of the charges had been dropped, that the rain had been blamed for the accident, not his inability to keep his eyes off of his phone and on the road. A lapse of judgment had changed his life forever, but at least he had crawled from the wreckage. The occupants of the other car hadn't been so lucky. 4 years had passed since that night, and just the notion that he would have to ride in a car filled him with dread and sent his stomach to swimming. But his wife was persistent. Kathy was a good woman, a sweet woman, but she was tired, and working a full-time job made it difficult for her to keep up with the extracurricular demands of their teenaged son, all on her lonesome. So Cliff bit the bullet and threw himself reluctantly into the search for a second car. Everything listed in their local paper was far outside of their price range, and those who went to the internet to sell their vehicles seemed incredibly optimistic about their rolling pieces of junk. Descriptions like, "runs great," "only works in reverse," and "great car, slightly rolled," failed to fill him with confidence. But a friend of a friend of a friend knew a guy who had a car he wanted to unload. Reluctant at first, Cliff eventually agreed to meet up with the stranger on a warm March afternoon. As he and his wife pulled into the dusty parking lot of Rick's junkyard, their eyes met, and neither seemed incredibly hopeful. With a soft smile that drew out the wrinkles at the corners of her eyes, Kathy shooed her husband from the car and watched as he disappeared into the building. His name tag said Rust, but the jovial man introduced himself as the eponymous Rick. He had a firm, honest handshake, and he smelled of body odor and motor oil. Cliff smiled weakly at him and followed him out into the junkyard. There was something about the final resting place of so many vehicles that filled Cliff with unshakable dread. Not all of the cars had been sold to Rick by their owners, nor had all of them been won at auctions. No. Some of the rusted hunks surrounding him had been salvaged from wrecks like the one that had left him a shell of his former self.
"You okay, man? You look a little pale."
Cliff looked into Rick's oil-streaked face and caught himself falling into a lean against the decaying husk of a Bel Air. "Yeah," he fibbed, his voice tinny and strange.
"Yeah, it's just hot out here."
Rick nodded grimly, and though he was unconvinced, he began walking again. 1 minute had passed, but Cliff felt as if he had been walking for hours. By the time they reached their destination, Cliff just wanted to go home. The sound of flesh slapping against metal drew Cliff's head from the clouds, and he winced when Rick smacked the hood of the Ford Taurus again.
"Ain't much to look at, I know,"
began Rick.
"but she runs. I heard your story, and man, that's just plain shit luck. $100 and she's yours, tax and title."
It might have been a nice car once, but that had been a while ago. Its silver paint was faded to the primer in places, and rust speckled it like a cheetah's spots. The front end had been salvaged from a red Taurus, as had the passenger side doors. Work like that, even if the materials had been salvaged, was certainly worth more than $100.
"Why so cheap? I'll be straight honest with you, Mr. Carson. It was in a wreck some time back. My son-in-law, he just took a shine to it, wanted to see if he could make it purr again. And like I said, I heard your story. She ain't perfect,
Rick went on.
but she'll get you where you need to go.
Only half convinced, Cliff followed Rick back into his shop to fork over the cash and fill out the paperwork. Kathy was elated, though Jeremy, their son, couldn't have cared less. And after a while, even Cliff found that he had a soft spot for the old Ford. It wasn't perfect. Rick had been honest about that. But it got Cliff from point A to point B, and more to the point, the radio worked. He would have been happy to drive the beater until the wheels fell off. But a month later, everything went to hell. It had started with a smell, not the rotting flesh of urban legend, but the putrid scent of congealing blood. Cliff had done everything to rid the car of the stench, from removing the seats to air it out, to getting the damned thing detailed. Nothing worked, and soon he was the only one in his family that would ride in the car willingly. Then the radio began malfunctioning. It began one night after he had dropped Jeremy off at soccer practice, when Patsy Cline's walking after midnight turned into an anguished woman's wailing. It had startled him so badly that he had nearly steered the Taurus off of the road. At first Cliff played it off, chalked it up to his rattled nerves, but soon the scream was joined by a man's baritone cries and a child's frightened keening. Though no one else seemed to hear what he heard, and despite his insistence, he eventually removed the radio altogether and threw it in the garbage. But that didn't stop it, and soon Cliff, who everyone was beginning to worry about, discovered that the radio had not been the cause at all. Those horrible sounds were coming from somewhere else inside of the car. Kathy begged him to go to the doctor, but Cliff was convinced that nothing was wrong with him and that the car was the cause of his distress. He tried to convince them that the damned thing was haunted, and when his son and his wife looked at him with concern and spoke about him as if he wasn't standing there, he would leave in a huff and go snag a few beers at the local bar. Then a week went by without so much as a peep from the car, and even the smell seemed to have disappeared. Elated, Cliff brought his wife flowers and his son a new soccer ball, and he convinced himself that somehow he had made a breakthrough. That night he took the Ford out for a long ride, a celebratory jaunt to gather his thoughts. The stretch of road he had chosen was a lonesome street bordered on both sides by thick clumps of pine trees. Cliff traveled it for an hour before he passed another car. Eventually his mind drifted towards a peaceful calm, and he began to think that perhaps his wife had been right, that the problems earlier had been products of his shattered mind. As he reached the end of the road and turned to return home, his headlights flickered before completely dying. He blinked, and despite the fear budding in his stomach, he simply attributed it to the car's mechanical flaws. A few clicks brought the lights back to life, but then all hell broke loose. The screams returned full force, buffeting him from every inch of the car, and soon his screams joined the hellish chorus. The smell returned, bringing with it the telltale stench of putrefying flesh, and he slammed his foot on the gas as if it could somehow outrun the terrors surrounding him. As the speedometer crept to 50, to 60, to 80, to 100, Cliff clawed frantically at his seatbelt, but the buckle wouldn't budge. As he scrambled to free himself, his terror-widened eyes darted to the rearview mirror, and the last thing he saw before the car plowed into the pine forest were the solemn features of a dead little boy, the right side of his face a mess of raw meat and bone. The police officer that had been sent to deliver the final verdict on the wreck was a kind man, and he seemed genuinely alarmed at what he would have to tell Cliff Carson's widow. Kathy looked at him with distant, tear-reddened eyes, her bottom lip trembling, and she listened as he told her that her husband had probably experienced an episode, that his death was no doubt quick, and that, coincidentally, Cliff's life had not been the only one claimed by the old Ford Taurus. 4 years before, it had been involved in another accident, one where the lives of 3 people had been claimed. It was the very same wreck that Cliff had been involved in, and wasn't that just the wildest coincidence?